The Canon 16-35 f2.8 lens versus the Sigma 18-35 f1.8. Both incredible lenses, both widely used by photographers and videographers, and Isaac, up here. Hey guys. When it comes to wide-angle lenses, the Canon 16-35 is a name that gets tossed around a lot, and for good reason. You can't go wrong when it comes to Canon L series glass. But sometimes our wallets beg to differ, and that's when you start looking at options that won't break the bank. One of those options would be the Sigma 18-35 1.8. The Canon 16-35 2.8 lens will run you about $2,000 on Amazon versus the Sigma 18-35, which is just about $600. That's over $1,000 you're gonna be saving if you choose to get a third-party lens. Now, Canon does offer a cheaper version of this lens at an f4 aperture for about $999. But for the purpose of this video, we are going to be using the f2.8 lens. So, is this lens worth the extra $1,200? To answer that question, we took both of these lenses and tested them on 3 different camera bodies. The Panasonic GH5 with a Metabones Speedbooster, the Canon T3i which has a cropped sensor, and the Canon 5D Mark IV which has a full-frame sensor. Hopefully after watching this video, you'll have a good idea of which lens is right for you. The first thing you're gonna notice, aside from the price tag, is the build quality. Both lenses feel well put together. The Sigma feels a bit more robust, and I know from personal experience that this lens can take a heavy hit because I dropped this lens from a table one night while filming a concert. And after changing my pants and assessing the damage, I was surprised to see that this little chip was the only damage the lens took. It still worked fine for the rest of the night. The zoom ring on the Sigma rotates clockwise to zoom in, while the one on the Canon rotates counterclockwise. But focus rings on both lenses rotate clockwise to focus on closer objects. Now, the Sigma is not a full-frame lens unlike the Canon, so if you are a full-frame camera owner, this might be a deal breaker for you because you're gonna get some crazy vignetting with this lens. But you can work around this if you have a camera that crops in when you shoot at 4K. Now, if you have a crop sensor camera, then you have some other things to consider. We took these lenses out and tested how they do in different categories. The first thing we tested these lenses on was sharpness and bokeh. Bokeh? Bokeh. Bokeh? Now, right off the bat, the Sigma is a faster lens at 1.8 versus Canon at 2.8, so you're already gonna be getting more bokeh if you shoot wide open. But we tested both lenses at f2.8 and f4. Here is a side-by-side comparison on the GH5 with a Speedbooster at f2.8. We got the Sigma on one side and the Canon on the other. Here they are at f4. And here's the same shot on the T3i with a cropped sensor. Again, here's at f2.8. And here it is at f4. Now, this might give away the answer, but here's the same shot on a 5D Mark IV, which has a full frame. Yeah, you have the Sigma on the right side with the very obvious vignetting versus the full frame 16-35 on the right. Overall, the Sigma has a bit more bokeh than the Canon, and it was a tad sharper when they were both open to f2.8. At f4, the sharpness was almost identical, so Sigma pulls away by just a hair in this category. So the next category we tested these lenses on was the field of view. Both lenses zoom in at 35, but we wanted to see if there was any difference in that focal length. Here is the Sigma on the GH5 at 35mm. And now on the Canon. Here's the same shot on the T3i with the Sigma, and now with the Canon. Again, both are pretty identical. And finally, here it is with the 5D Mark IV. This is the Canon, and now the Sigma. Even at 35mm, you just can't escape the vignetting on the Sigma, and there's also some stretching near the corners. This might not be an issue if you have a camera that crops in at 4K, but if you plan on using the full sensor of your camera, then the vignetting is just something you're gonna have to deal with. Moving on to the next test, which is to see any changes in brightness whether you zoom in or out with either lens. Both of these lenses are constant aperture, which means they will stay at the aperture you leave them in whether you zoom in or out. But we still wanted to see if there's any slight change in brightness. Here's the Sigma on the GH5 at f1.8. Zooming in, there isn't much of a change. Even bringing it down to f4, it stayed pretty consistent. The Canon at 2.8 was pretty consistent too, but closing it to f4, there's a pretty big change in the brightness, even though it stays at f4. Doing the same thing on the T3i, the Sigma had a pretty big change in brightness at f1.8, whereas the Canon at 2.8 stayed pretty consistent. Finally, on the 5D Mark IV, both lenses stayed pretty consistent throughout their focal lengths. There is a small drop in brightness on the Sigma, but it's almost unnoticeable. The next test was focus tracking. Now, the GH5 is not well known for its focus tracking capabilities, and the T3i doesn't even have it. So we left this test just to the 5D. And both lenses held up pretty well. There weren't many significant differences between the timing. With Isaac popping in and out of screen, Canon may have had a tad bit more responsiveness, but you can't really notice unless you're really paying attention. Although, Sigma seemed to show less breathing when shifting focus. We also tried back button focus with both lenses. On the GH5, Canon was able to switch between Isaac and the light stand pretty quickly and accurately, while Sigma had some challenges hitting the target. Switching to the 5D Mark IV, the Sigma was not bad at switching, but the Canon was pretty quick to change between Isaac and the light stand. And then finally, there's the T3i. So it took a while, but even on this camera, the Canon seems a tad bit more responsive than on the Sigma. Overall, the Canon 16-35 seems a bit faster when it comes to autofocusing than the Sigma. Distortion is a big thing to consider when you are getting a wide-angle lens. In this case, a crop sensor camera may be your savior to minimize any bending you might see in the edges. Here are both lenses with the GH5. You can see more with the Canon since it's at 16mm, but you're also getting more bending in the lines. Then again, when we zoom into 35, the Sigma has more inward bending. Doing the same thing on the T3i, there's actually minimal difference between the two lenses. Even zooming in all the way, it's just too close to tell. Finally, on the 5D Mark IV, we see the Canon having some bending in the sides. Not so much with the Sigma, but you have a bigger problem with the vignetting than with the distortion. Zooming into 35mm on both lenses, the Canon seems to be doing a little better than the Sigma. And again, still visible darkness around the edges on the Sigma because of the vignetting. Next up is the chromatic aberration test, also known as fringing. Thankfully, both lenses are very sharp and don't give much fringing, but if I had to make a call on which lens was slightly better, it would go to the Canon. Overall, which lens do you think did better? Both lenses are sharp and fast. The question is the 16-35 2.8 worth $1,200 more, or is it better to get the Sigma 18-35 and use that money saved towards getting more gear? My full frame camera users, if you're still watching this, would you take a chance on the Sigma 18-35, or are you going to avoid it at all costs? Remember, if you have a camera that crops in at 4K, you can still avoid that vignetting a little more. That's it for this video, guys. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you want us to make another comparison video. If you like this video, please help us out by leaving a like and subscribing for more content. Thanks so much for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next video.